Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Beckham and the subject here is layers, of course, but bracketed exposure balance. Now I would describe this as corrective editing, but I think it also has a degree of creative editing too. In any exposure where the contrast range within our scene is higher than the camera can capture, we have a problem. And that's not uncommon when you're shooting outdoors. If we expose for the foreground as we have here, the sky burns out, and that's clearly shown to us with the clipping warning which I have got turned on from the extreme top right of the screen. The red area is showing me that I have no pixels at all in that particular part of the sky because the exposure was too much, but the foreground looks great. If I take a shot where I expose just for the sky, then the shadows start to block up, and you can see that in this example here with the blue shaded areas where I've got the shadow clipping warning turned on from the top left of the histogram. Now what we're looking at here is the same image with a bit more clarity, some shadow detail brought up, and the exposure brought up. And it looks quite good here until we start to zoom in. And when we zoom in, we notice around these areas that we've got a lot of noise. Now, one answer to this problem is to take multiple exposures, at least 2 shots, and combine them through Adobe Camera Raw, Smart Objects, and Photoshop Layers. Now here I have 2 shots with 3 stops of exposure between them. One is exposed for the highlights and the other for the shadows. With the image highlighted on the right, if you look up at the extreme left, you'll see a little +1 in the camera data in the top left. That means that this image got 1 more stop of exposure than the camera felt was right. This image got 2 stops less exposure than the camera felt was right. Now some photographers tackle this problem by carrying graduated filters around in their camera bag, and they place them over the lens to adjust the exposure at the time they press the shutter button. Now I think this technique is far more versatile, and it's going to save a whole heap of money because these filters are expensive. It certainly saves us the issues of having to carry them around in our camera bag, and in some certain circumstances where it's difficult to put the camera bag down on the ground to get the filters out of the bag, they can be troublesome to use too. What I'm going to do here is step around this problem by using 2 images, Adobe Camera Raw, Smart Objects, and particularly Photoshop and layer masks. Now both of these images were shot from a tripod, so the register between the 2 images is not a problem to us, but even if we handheld them and there was a slight difference, we can auto align layers in Photoshop, and that's very powerful too. So as you can see here, I've got both of my images opened up into Camera Raw, and I can select either one of them, or holding the Shift key I can select both of them. What I would be doing here is the global editing that I want to do to both. Color balance, maybe chromatic aberration, that sort of thing. But then once I've done that, I'm not going to do too much else. Maybe I'll add a bit of clarity because that's generally something I add to all images, and maybe a little bit of color because all these things are changeable anyway. But I'm going to open up both of these images into Photoshop, then create a layered stack of them. Now we can see from the layered stack that I've just dragged one layer into the other. Both of these are raw smart objects, as we can see by the symbol here, so we have ultimate control in being able to double click any one of these thumbnails and to adjust them independently in Camera Raw. When we're putting two layers together like this, sometimes if we edit them independently, we're going to get the balance wrong. In fact, I would say I get the balance wrong 7 times out of 10. But of course, having the two layers as they are, I can open them back up into Camera Raw and make that balance anytime I wish. Now let's see if I can demonstrate what I mean by just selecting the top layer, and I'm going to put a mask to the right of my smart object. To make parts of this layer transparent so that the sky from the one beneath shows through, what I'm going to do is use my gradient tool from the toolbox. So if we go to the bottom of the toolbar first, we need to make sure black is our foreground color. I'm going to select the standard gradient tool here. The default setting of linear mode, and from the drop down palette at the top left, foreground to transparent. Because all I've got to do is to draw a line from maybe just a little above the horizon there. I'm going to use the shift key to do this, and I should be able to balance both of them. Now I can come down further if I wish, and now you can see what I mean when I start to talk about getting the balance between the two right. If I'm going to live with the density I've got in that sky, then the foreground looks a little bit unbalanced. What I do need to do is zoom into the background and make sure that once I've got my mask revealing parts of both of the layers, that I don't have any ghosting, which would tell me that the images are not perfectly in register. They are, so I can proceed without any problem. Now in fact here I'm going to see if I can squeeze even more power out of that sky. So I'm going to select my smart object, double click, it opens back up. I'm just looking at the sky and the sky alone. It does seem to have a bit of a magenta look to it. That may have been natural, I can't remember now, but I'm going to have a look at just moving my tint slider a little bit away from the magenta side. Maybe I'll even warm up the picture a little bit, or certainly the sky. And what I could do is take down the blacks a little bit to give it a little bit more power in the sky. And I could ignore what it's doing on the foreground, of course. But you will notice I've got a bit of a weakness over on the right hand side, a few little dust spots to deal with, and a little bit of weakness on the left side in the sky, of course. So I'm going to pick up my adjustment brush. I will just brush over that area to create the pin, reset everything on the right hand side here, and maybe drop the exposure down and start to do a little bit of work up in the corners just to keep that a little bit more solid up there. And I can always look at a little bit of dehaze, sometimes that helps. And over on the right hand side I can do the same. You can see the changes are quite subtle, and most of the time they need to be. If I'm happy with that, I can then open this up into Photoshop, but in fact all I'm doing is adjusting the layer that's already there. But of course now we can see even more that the foreground doesn't have quite the balance, so the foreground needs to be darkened a little. So let's select it and open it up into Camera Raw. Now in the other layer I did adjust the tint a little bit. I'm going to do the same here. I think I'm just going to drop that down a bit, bring up the temperature just a little bit as well. Now what we're doing here with this lighter layer is most of the editing we're doing is from light to dark, and that retains the image quality nicely. Now I could possibly squeeze a little bit of shadow detail in here, but I don't think I need it, to be honest. What I may need is a little more colour in the foreground, and I certainly need it to be slightly darker, and I probably need it to be darker in the corners, much like I did before. Now I can do that in a couple of ways. I think I'd like to do it here maybe with a graduated filter. I'm going to drop the size of the image down, pick up my graduated filter, just bring it in the corner there, and I'll have a little bit of it stretching across this side, but that's rather too much, so I'll double click and reset the dehaze and the exposure, hit the V key to hide that overlay, and I'll just drop the exposure down mainly on the left hand side just to give my image some balance, and I can click OK to open this up into Photoshop. And straight away we've got a good balance between the two, but of course we can fine tune these. If I now feel that I've got maybe I've gone a bit too far with the sky, then let's double click the sky. Let's just lift the exposure a little bit there, not much, and if I just want to hold the top of the sky in, you can see I could put a graduated filter there too, just to hold the top in. All these things are available to us. Look at the flexibility we have backwards and forwards between camera raw to be able to capture just the sort of shot that we want. Now I could go on and on. For example, if I go back to the sky layer, I could start to think about some of the lighter parts of the sky. What sort of effect would I get if I drop the highlights? Well, that's an improvement, not too much because we start to get an unnatural yellow, but certainly a little bit of highlights being moved down does help us quite a bit, and I like the effect, so I'm going to select that. With the foreground, what I may do is lift some of the tones around this area here, so let me just double click that. I may even darken the overall thing very slightly, but then via an adjustment brush I may just brush over this area to create a pin, and maybe I'd lift the tones there, and may even try a little bit of shadow detail because I like the colours that are being brought through here by the setting sun in the distance. Well, we're all going to choose something different. I think you probably have got the gist of this technique. Of course, we would save this as a layered Photoshop file, so we retain both these layers and the mask and the fact that we've got these as smart objects. But of course, at some stage we would flatten to finish. So once I do have my image saved, I can go to the top right of the layers and I can choose to flatten this to just do the fine tuning of the image. One of the things I may want to do, or I'm going to have to do, is deal with the dust spots over on the right hand side. There looks to be quite a few there, but they really are not a problem. They're going to take us seconds to deal with. But if you're a bit nervous about dealing with these little dust spots and or distractions like I appear to have a surfer in the water there, we can use layers for that too. Because if you create a new layer over the top of any image you're working on and go and select the spot healing brush, as long as you make sure you tick the box at the top of the screen that says sample all layers, then when I click all these little spots, and I'll quickly do that. Now I'm sitting in quite a light room at the moment. The sun is on the window, and although there's blinds there, it's affecting my ability to see into the dark shadows. So one of the things with dealing with these dust spots is you do have to look at your image more than once because you're almost certain to miss one or two. Let me just wipe over that surfer there and try to get rid of him or her. That didn't work too well, so I'm going to go to my history. I'm going to back off of that, and maybe I'll choose a different method here. I'll switch to the healing brush, and once again make sure you select here current layer and below. That way we're going to clone or heal to a new layer. So I'll just zoom in a little bit because here I need to take a clone source using the Alt key from just to the right there, and then perhaps a couple of touches, and I think we'll probably be able to live with that. I don't think there's anything else, although there may be some more dust marks up on the left hand side, and I'd have to look very carefully to make sure I've cleared all of those. Now with the spinning round of the screen, what I've done is use the spot healing brush just to touch in one or two little distractions in the foreground. They're natural things, little bits of rock that pick up the light and throw it into the camera lens. They just need to be touched away, and because I've put them all on a new layer here, if I turn them on and off, you do get an idea of just how damaging they can be. You can see the light shining on the rocks on the left hand side in the middle. I've taken them away, and if I turn it on and off, you'll see lots of little highlights that I've removed that just improve the picture. And to finish, I'm going to flatten and do two things which are, I think, great tips for much of my photography, and I hope yours too. First of all, with seascapes and landscapes, they always look nicer if they're a little bit more panoramic. Well, let's use the tools of Photoshop here by going to Image, Image Size, but rather than link in the width and the height, we can unlink them. So I'm going to choose to put 400 pixels on the width of my image, so I'm going to overwrite 5616 with 6000, but it doesn't change the height. So when I click OK, you can see we get a nice slightly elongated shape, which just seems to work nicer for seascapes and landscapes. And finally, a vignette. We get the opportunity to do this in RAW if we're working with just one image, but when we're working with two, well, we can wait until we get to this stage. I'm going to pick up my lasso tool, and I'm just going to make an irregular shape around my image. You can see it's nothing that takes me any time at all. That looks to be about it. I need to inverse that selection, so I've got the outer edge selected, so select, inverse, and from select and mask, because I'm working on a 20 megapixel camera, I know from experience I need to be 400 pixels plus, let's say 450. I'm going to output that change in the feather to a selection, but then I'll hide the selection. Control H will do that, so the selection is there, it's still working, but it's just out of our eye line for the moment. What I'd like to pick up now is my levels, so Image, Adjustment, Levels, Control L is the shortcut, and all I want to do is to drag down the mid-tone slider a little bit. Look at the difference that makes. We don't want to go down too far, but we certainly need to go down to a degree that it just makes us look into the center of the image, and we can check this by turning the preview on and off. So there it is, it's fairly subtle. If I open this picture up with the vignette on, you wouldn't instantly see it, but look at that, it's having quite a difference to the finished job. Control D will remove that selection, and there we have our finished image. I'll finish this section by saying there is no way I'm going to spend good money to carry around a load of graduated filters that once they're applied to the image I shot, they can't be removed, when I've got the ability to do it much better and more efficiently using Camera Raw, Smart Objects, Layers and Masks. So maybe we can just take a minute to look at the finished image full screen and just cast our mind back to the two images we used to create it. The one that creates the sky we see here, the foreground was very dark. Yes, I could have raised the shadow detail from that foreground, but I'd been fighting noise all the time, so I would have been badly affecting my image quality. But the other layer, where the sky was completely burnt out and lost pixels completely, I had great exposure on the foreground. That allowed all of the editing in the foreground not to be from dark tones to light, which gives us a problem with noise, but it was from light tones to dark, which never does. Dealing with high contrast in our images is a battle that all photographers have to fight from time to time, and it's not just solved by using image editing. We have to get the exposure right too.